Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Bevridge panel discussion on the topic of rye. My name is SUSANNAH SKIVER BARTON. I'll be your moderator tonight. I'm a whiskey and spirits writer and critic. You can find me on social media, Twitter, Instagram at What Tastes Good. We have a couple of great guests tonight, but before we get started, I have a little housekeeping to take care of, so I'm going to do that first. First, these panels are a great way to learn about spirits, not just whiskey, but all kinds of spirits, everything from terroir and ice to investing. They take place weekly, so please come back next week. Also, check out the archive on bevridge.co. There's a lot to learn, and we're always exploring new topics, so please continue to join us. Thank you for being here tonight. We want to hear from you. While you're here, there's a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please drop your comments, have a conversation. We will not be offended if you decide to chat amongst yourselves while the panelists and I are talking. That's totally fine. There's also a Q&A box. If you have questions you'd like to ask at any point during the conversation, please throw them in there. We'll either get to them as we go along, or we'll cover them at the end before we wrap up the hour. You can also upvote a question, your own or someone else's, if there's something you're just dying to know, and that'll make it higher on the list, and we'll get to it first. So tonight's topic is rye, America's first native whiskey. I think everyone who's in attendance probably knows bourbon as the truly American whiskey, but before there was bourbon, there was rye. It was the very first whiskey style to really take hold in America, even before we were a country. It originated on the early frontier among farmers, and it has a really interesting history. Bourbon came along behind it, but they really ruled side by side for decades, even centuries, until Prohibition came along and obviously shook up everything about whiskey and spirits in America. And after that, rye really went into a huge decline. But good news is we are now in 2022. Rye has been in a renaissance for well over a decade. Large distillers, craft distillers, mixologists, and people like you and me are all excited about rye again, and there's a lot more out there to explore and enjoy than there ever has been in our lifetimes. So we're going to talk about all of that tonight. We have two great expert guests about rye, about both its history and its modern iteration. Our first guest is Bradford Lawrence, the Global Small Batch DNA and Education Manager for Beam SUNTORY. Bradford, can you introduce yourself and kind of explain that mouthful of a title for us?
Yes. Thanks for having me. Super excited to be part of this panel. Yeah, it's quite a bit of a lengthy title, but I specialize inside Beam as a protector of our legacy stories for a lot of our small batch brands. I'm there to help celebrate, help spread the good word of all these iconic stories that we've got. And we've got some amazing ryes too that have their own stories to be told. So that's in a nutshell. I wear a lot of different hats, but in a nutshell, I'm just a storyteller for Beam.
I like protector of the rye. That's a really sweet title, and I hope you consider putting that on your business card.
I might have that trademarked. Let's see.
Our second guest tonight is a distiller. This is Herman Mihalich. He's the founder and distiller at DAD'S HAT RYE. Herman, I understand, has rye whiskey more or less in his blood, being descended from other whiskey distillers and having grown up above the family tavern. Herman, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, growing up above the family tavern for sure. Other distillers in the family, that was only done in a very artisanal way. My grandfather had a still, and my dad also operated, and I operated briefly before I moved to college. But and it was that is now, that small still is now in our distillery, and it's a legally registered still, by the way. So it's no longer being operated clandestine fashion. So we started DAD'S HAT RYE whiskey now 10 years ago. And with the objective of bringing rye whiskey back to its home in Pennsylvania. So I did grow up above what was a speakeasy that became the family tavern in the 30s. My grandfather cut his teeth drinking rye whiskey in the 20s, or even, in the teens, 100 years ago, from what was then the largest rye whiskey distillery in North America, the Gibson Distillery. It's about a 7-iron from where I grew up. So So my grandfather drank rye whiskey until he passed away at the age of 95, and it was served at our bar. And one of my favorite photos is a picture from 1954. My mother's behind the bar, and over her shoulder is prominently displayed on the top shelf, not the bottom shelf, the top shelf, a bottle of Old Overholt, because back in those days that was top shelf whiskey. So and my grandfather's favorite, and that was at the end in '85 when he was when he was 95. That's basically all we could find was because all the older Pennsylvania brands were gone, and Old Overholt was still available. So he was thankful it was still around, and we're glad to see what Beam's doing to resurrect the brand. It's really it's good stuff. So anyway, so I bring a lot of that practical experience to the table. I use my nose and my taste buds to guide me based on the things I remember serving my grandfather when he moved back, when my grandpa moved back with us in his older years. My job was bringing him his medicine every day. So and that was usually 2 fingers of rye whiskey. So.
Well, he lived to 95, so I'd say cheers to that. I definitely poured myself some rye. I have some a nice Russell's Reserve rye, single barrel here, that comes out for special occasions. But anyone else who's drinking rye or otherwise, let us know in the chat. I'm always interested to see what people have poured. I know Bradford's got some Overholt Bonded. So
I'm drinking that. I have a Dad's Hat single barrel, so that's
lovely.
Also the good stuff. You foreshadowed quite a bit some of the things we're going to talk about, but I want to start by just setting the scene and kind of laying out the context for rye whiskey and its early history and its origins in the United States. And Bradford, I know you know quite a bit about this as a historian. So can you tell us how rye predates bourbon by at least multiple decades, possibly longer. How did rye become the first whiskey made in what was not yet America? Where was it being made, and when was this happening?
Yeah, so that's a great story. It goes back to probably as early as the 12th century. People have been cooking, fermenting, distilling, whatever source of sugar or starch they could find. So it's no surprise that when American colonists brought families over, they also brought their love and their distilling knowledge of alcohol to the New World as well, especially with the Scots, the Irish, and the German. In particular, German immigrant distilling prowess was really around rye grain, and that's what really stuck in Pennsylvania and Maryland when they arrived on our shores. Germans actually had a spirit called Korn, Korn. Otherwise, I think it's also known as Kornbrand. It's like grain brandy. And it's a colorless distilled beverage, it's fermented, but from grain. Typically it's rye, wheat, barley, oats, and perhaps some buckwheat was thrown in there as well. But predominantly the grain that was used for this corn was rye or wheat. So they brought all that over to the New World. And when they went west, and you got to think they landed in the Philadelphia or Baltimore area, like moving west into like southwestern Pennsylvania, which is where like a lot of the rye history really started to take root. That was the Wild West out there. So distilling, that kind of like that farm distilling mentality, it stems from some basic needs to survive. So during the colonization of the New World, there was a heavy reliance on alcohol because more often than not, it was a healthy alternative to the local water source. A number of these really small grain distilleries, they popped up into the interior, like just outside the fledgling colonies, and most of them were they were functioning pieces of farm equipment. When there was too much grain and it was on the verge of spoiling, distill it. If there was too much snow on the ground for the livestock to graze, run the distillery, feed the grain to the livestock. If there was a need to go to market, right, and barter and trade and sell, selling grain, okay, but if you're able to distill that and get a higher value and lower volume too, so like your transportation costs, all that stuff starts to drop and you get more money, so higher profit, distilling grain and selling whiskey. So that's kind of where it really started to take root. And then rye, not like having the past history of working with the rye grain in Germany and Switzerland, and then coming over to the New World. Rye was really, really well suited for the climate of Pennsylvania and Maryland. Corn, not so much. Corn is great below the Mason-Dixon line. So you talk about just from a strictly like a farming economic side of things, rye was the grain to use. Yeah, that's pretty much. I mean, I could keep going, but
yeah, that sums it up.
Yeah.
So, and of course, we know. I think, well, for those who don't know, as people pushed west after the Revolutionary War and pushed into Kentucky and Tennessee and kind of parts further west where corn does grow more easily, that became more of the base for whiskey that eventually became known as bourbon. But until the 1920s, until Prohibition, bourbon and rye were really side by side, kind of, two oxen hitched to the same cart. You could have bourbon whiskey, you could have rye whiskey, you could have just whiskey, that maybe was not designated one or the other. But certainly rye had this reputation, whether it was Maryland or Pennsylvania style. And then Prohibition hit, that shook everything up. After Prohibition, we did see this, bourbon come back and other spirits, but rye kind of did not. There was some consumption, but it declined and declined and declined until we get to the 80s, when, we'll talk about this in a minute, when the last whiskey distillery in Pennsylvania closed. No more Pennsylvania rye. And there was only a handful of distillers in Kentucky making rye. So do we know why that particular moment in history, that Prohibition and repeal, why that was such a blow for rye?
I have a theory. My theory is that during Prohibition, much of the whiskey that was being smuggled into the U.S. from Canada was initially was based on rye also, but the Canadians didn't have a lot of whiskey to sell, and they were cutting their whiskey with neutral spirits like blended whiskeys. So, and they continued to call it rye. And even at the end of Prohibition, when they no longer had a lot of stocks of aged whiskey to sell, they were just adding. They were doing rectifying with caramel color and prune juice and tobacco. So but they still called it rye for marketing reasons. And so when rye was able to be made again, the reputation had been damaged. And I think the rye whiskey producers in North America, some of whom were purchased by Canadian companies, they decided to go the cheap and cheerful route and make it, to try to be competitive with Canadian blended whiskey. And I think they chose a very difficult battle, because the Canadians had already established themselves to be able to make large quantities at very good costs.
Yeah,
that's my theory. So.
Yeah, Herman, to build on that, there's a few things that I think happened just prior to Prohibition, and then the nail in the coffin, so to speak, for rye. In just at the turn of the century, like 1899, 1900, like something of the amount of like 375,000 gallons of whiskey were being produced, right? And like almost half of that was rye whiskey, right? But there was an interesting, like the Overholt brand in 1905 was a 1.4 million case brand, massive. It was huge. It's nowhere near that now, but it was, rye was king, because you think, yes, people were going west and distilleries were popping up and making bourbon in Kentucky and whatnot, but the major epicenters of people where people lived was still in the Northeast. And there was a need to satiate the palates of consumers in the Northeast, because that's where those big populations were. And rye was fitting that bill. So rye was king, pretty much all the way up to Prohibition. But I have another theory that I think there was some serious lobbying happening on behalf of the on behalf of Kentuckians, because during Prohibition, there were only a few distillers that you're able to actually distill or actually sell and advertise whiskey. To keep up with that that stock, the federal government said, all right, you guys are able to fire up your stills. I think it was once, maybe twice, because I know in particular, Overholt at the Bradford Distillery went online on February 22nd in 1930, and they were to fire up the stills. But there was a caveat, like, oh, cool, we can distill, get our stocks back up to keep this Prohibition medicinal whiskey thing alive, because it was benefiting the federal government. But when that decree came down, the rye producers weren't allowed to make as much as the bourbon producers. Hence, the Kentucky lobbying saying, "Hey, if we go online, you're gonna allow us to produce exponentially more than, let's say, large distillery in PA or the Bradford distillery in PA with Overholt." So right out of the gate, coming out of Prohibition, your rye producers everyone's struggling, right? But the rye producers don't have anywhere close to the amount of stocks that the bourbon producers had. So coming out of Prohibition, consumer tastes are changing, of course, but there's also this like massive amount of liquid that bourbon players have to work with and get out into market, when the rye producers didn't have that luxury.
That's super interesting. I had no idea. So you credit that to just someone having the right person's ear in Washington, or maybe lining the right pockets. That's crazy.
100%. Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, I think like 75% of like that allocation during Prohibition went to Kentucky producers. 25%, give or take, were whatever rye producers were left, in typically in southwestern PA or in some Maryland producers. They had 25% of that, so the lion's share went to Kentucky.
Which is funny, because the Secretary of the Treasury at the time was an investor in
right.
That's right.
But as long as Overholt was taken care of, forget the other small distillers, or distillers of any size. They were competitors, right? So he took care of Overholt fine, and everyone else, forget him.
Yeah, Andrew Mellon was he was partnered with Henry Clay Frick, who owned the brand. Henry Clay Frick purchased the Overholt brand in 1881 from his grandfather, from his family, because Henry Clay Frick, Steel Titan and Steel and Coke Titan, he bought it for $1, everything, name, rights, the whole kit and caboodle. I have a sneaking suspicion that was a hostile takeover, but they so Frick brought on Andrew Mellon, the banker, right, and because Andrew Mellon was Secretary of Treasury, he was able to negotiate and get a medicinal license for Overholt to be produced at Bradford. But then he actually had to decouple himself from it. So he sold it to another company, I think it was Park and Tilford, or some other company. But he was on the board of trustees. So it was like he had his fingers in a lot of stuff.
A little cozy.
It was very cozy, yeah.
So for one reason or another, and I think we've heard some really good ones, rye certainly was on the decline from Prohibition onwards, and Pennsylvania rye in particular, even though it had been this real juggernaut, by 1989, 1990, the Michter's distillery, the last distillery making whiskey in Pennsylvania, closed its doors. 20 years later, Herman, you just got it in your head that you wanted to be a distiller in a state with no distilleries in a generation. How did you first, tell us a little bit about why you decided you wanted to open a distillery, and then tell us how you figured out how to do it. How did you even begin to learn to make rye? It must have been pretty hard.
Well, the idea popped into my head when there was an article in the New York Times, which you can look up online, in 2006, which was a story about how rye was starting to make a kind of a renaissance, driven by a lot of cocktail guys in New York. And there was this prediction that rye was going to make a comeback. So at the time, I was gainfully employed in the real world, with a suit and tie and all that stuff. And I used to joke around with my business partner, John Cooper, and say, wouldn't it be fun to bring whiskey back to Pennsylvania? And at first, it was just kind of a joke. He's like, yeah, right. Have another drink and, be quiet. But we kept an eye on it. And by 2008 or 9, we confirmed that indeed that was happening. We started looking at the statistics, and saw that the growth was there. And so I was in between positions. I left one company and I was looking for another job. And while I was doing that, my brother encouraged me to write a business plan and said, hey, while you're, sitting around doing nothing, write a business plan and on that distillery idea. And so I wrote the business plan and I showed it to John, and he goes, well, we could do this. And I'm like, really? He said, yeah. So we contacted the first couple rounds of investors were guys that John and I have known for now, 40 years, and guys we went to school with mostly. And they ponied up some money, and John and I spent time going back and forth to Michigan State University, who used to have the artisan distillery program there. And I'm a chemical engineer by training, so I had a little bit of background. I did a little bit of distilling with my grandpa back in the day. My 8th grade science project was a still, so I had a notion of how to do it. But we did a lot of research, looking at online and what kind of mash bills were used back in Pennsylvania back in the old days and all that kind of stuff. We got some tweaking and guidance from Michigan State. Like, one of the things that I'm very thankful for from the advice we got from them was, instead of using distillers malt, we're using 2-row brewer's malt, which we think really adds a lot of flavor to our rye. So we were able to test recipes on the Carl still that they had, and we purchased a Carl still, a pot still, and so we were able to start up day one with a process in hand. And we actually brought one of the guys from Michigan State, paid him for a week to visit with us to write our standard operating procedures and go through startup with us. So we took a rather scientific approach to it. I'm a Poindexter engineer, so it's so we did our homework, and so we stuck to, and we still stick to, a classic Pennsylvania style. It's 80% grain, 20% malt, and no corn. So that's kind of where we got started, and it all came from that. It was really that article in 2006 where they tasted a bunch of the only ryes they could find, and now fortunately my wife, very observant as she is, went out and bought almost all of the whiskeys that were in that article. So that at one point in time, I had a pretty nice collection, including the famous Red Hook Rye from Linnell's in New York.
Oh, wow.
And
lucky you.
Yeah, it's all, but I drink them. I don't keep them. But Rittenhouse 23 and, a bunch of stuff like that was, that's all gone now. But I wish I would have kept it. I could sell it for, a bunch of money.
But you're selling your own rye now. So
Yeah.
along the way, you've been making it for 10 years. What's the most surprising thing you've learned in this whole journey, whether about whiskey, about distilling, about people who drink rye?
The most interesting thing is that we're still learning. I mean, even after 10 years, we're, even though we keep pretty much to our knitting, we've never done gin. We've always done, just rye whiskey. We do some playing with the finishing and so in the barrel aging, but we stick to the same basic recipe. But even to that, I mean, about a year and a half ago, we were playing around with on this finishing run on the still, trying some things, and learned a few things that I wish I would have known 8 years ago, on how we're running the still. So that plus, having some fun with them. We'll talk about this maybe later about the different grains we're playing with, the different rye grains. That adds some interest and that challenge to continuing to, we want to continue to improve all the time. So, so that, learning that you never know as much as you think, I guess is the point. So
That's just good advice for life, no matter what business you're in.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about Pennsylvania rye. We've mentioned a little bit about Maryland rye, but I want to dig deeper into what these terms actually mean, because as a drinker, I've seen them bandied about for years, but it's not often that I get a chance to taste an antique rye that actually, was labeled Maryland rye or Old Monongahela style. But these were terms that had real meanings 100 years ago. Maybe a little more. You've got a 1940 era old Overholt.
Oh, wow.
Stop showing off.
Man, you're putting me to shame, Herman.
I know Bradford's got some of that Sasha.
I'm not drinking it now, but I might crack it open.
That's awesome. Can we talk a little bit about what we know, just about what these styles tasted like, how they were made, what made them distinct, other than just, okay, it came from Pennsylvania or it came from Baltimore? I know Bradford and Herman, you both can probably say something about Old Monongahela or Pennsylvania style rye. If you can educate us a little bit on Maryland rye, what we know of that, and maybe talk about Kentucky rye as we know it. Just help us understand, for those of us who have not, let's say, been privileged enough to kind of taste these old styles, what we might have tasted if we'd lived 100 years ago.
Go for it, Bradford.
Well, I'll start with the Old Monongahela style. So Monongahela is an Algonquin word spoken by the Lenape, and it means loosely translated to river with sliding banks. So the Monongahela is a river in southwestern Pennsylvania that's part of this tributary that eventually feeds the Ohio River. So southwestern PA, kind of the heartland of that style, the Pennsylvania style rye, is on the same limestone shelf that Kentucky sits on. So that beautiful water that gives bourbon its that nice little feather in the cap for the bourbon guys. Same limestone shelf in southwestern PA. No corn, a healthy dose, that 80-20 kind of that benchmark. But you also see Monongahela style ryes creep up to that 95. So it's the big thing that you want to take away is the no corn aspect to it. There's even some instances where they could have been using wheat as well, but generally speaking, from like a macro kind of look, it's that 80-20 kind of benchmark. So right out of the gate, it's going to be really robust and full and spicy. But when I say spicy, I don't mean like that sharp spice. There's a roundness to Old Monongahela style ryes. And I also think it has to come down to the type of stills that were being used as well. And there's been some recent research over the last few years into the 3-chamber still, which Todd Leopold out of Leopold Brothers in Denver has one. There's another 3-chamber out in Washington from a little town distiller. The name is escaping me. And they also use a Vulcan 3-chamber in a Barbados rum distillery that they just revitalized a couple of years ago. So this is like this weird in-between technology from the pot still, right, to the advent of the column still. So column stills are like super, and they are super efficient. You can run them hard for a long time, and you can really get. For all intents and purposes, you could push a button on a column still, let it do its thing, or you can get in there and get nerdy with it too. But there's this efficiency that column stills offer. A lot of that actually comes from the war effort, World War I and World War II, because a lot of distilleries they couldn't make whiskey for consumption. They had to make whiskey for the war efforts. So they chose to kind of adopt this newer technology that was more efficient. But going back to the 3-chamber, it's this in-between tech that it's kind of like I think a quote from Dave Wondrich, actually, if I can remember it. It's kind of like he looks at a 3-chamber as a bolt action rifle, whereas the pot still is a muzzle loader and the column still is a machine gun. Right, so
that's a pretty fair characterization.
Yeah, and what the 3-chamber still was able to do is you have all these lovely oily, weighty flavors that you find from a pot still, and you can't really walk away from a pot still. You talk to the Scotch guys over in Scotland, like there's somebody you're watching that through every step of the process, right? But it also combines the efficiency of a column still, so you get this really lovely, like floral note. So not only do you have the grains, what kind of grain was being used, like whether it was a Brutzi or Rosen. So you have this like more heritage-based grains, right? And then you have this interesting technology for distillation that is allowing for these like really heavy weights to come through, and kind of get this really viscous, lovely spirit with this like lavender floral nose. And I almost like to say it like a lot of the ryes today are kind of, they have a lot of like dill, a bit, and there's a dryness to them. If you ever have a chance to have some of the old, like the Richard Mellon Overholts from like 1910, 1911, there's this like warm baritone note. It's a warm spice. It's so hard to describe it. Once you taste it, you're like, aha, I get it. So like this old Monongahela style, I dream of the day that we get back to that, because I think there's like the rye has it's lost its way over the last half a century or so, and thanks to the you know the likes of guys like Herman, like steering the ship back to what rye should taste like, we're on a great path. So we'll get there. We'll get back to that old style. But yeah, that's kind of what my personal take on the old Monongahela is. There's nothing like it. There's nothing like it. Yeah.
Awesome. Do either of you know much about Maryland rye? My understanding is that there's not a whole lot to know style-wise, but I know it had more corn content. I mean, it actually had corn in it. That was a big difference between that and old Monongahela.
There was a lot of rectifying going on in Maryland also, where they were making modified. I mean, look, people do barrel finishes and people do all kinds of things with whiskey these days, and they were maybe you consider them ahead of their time by rectifying, modifying their spirit to meet their consumer tastes. So, a lot of those old brands were rectified whiskeys. So.
And you bring up a good point, Herman. Yeah,
go ahead, Bradford. Yeah,
you talk about the consumers again. I mentioned earlier, like that. This is where people were living, right? And the epicenters, city centers, were in this Maryland region. And you also had the Navy, you had the military, there's just all of this energy being put into the Northeast. Rectifying isn't bad. Like, there's some rectifiers that would add the prune juice or the tobacco or spit on it, right? But there's some rectifiers like what's his name? The guy from that started Four Roses was a So rectifying was actually happening across the country.
Sure.
But yeah, Maryland style is it's weird. It's nebulous. You have this kind of prevailing theory that it had some extra corn in it. Maybe it did. There's some Baltimore Maryland ryes that are 95.5. So it's a little gray. I'd be more curious as to, as we kind of look forward, like what the Maryland style can mean in the future. Because there's like the term rectifying, like at the end of the day, it's blending, right? Well, part of it is blending, and there's a lot of art to that. So as a rectifier, like you're trying to make a spirit that's really tasty because you want to sell more and more of it, right? So it's in your best interest to make a good tasting spirit. So there was some artistry to those rectified style of Maryland rye, but there was also rectifiers in Pennsylvania. There's also rectifiers in Kentucky. Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to see where Maryland ends up, and actually think maybe they lock down an actual this is what we stand for as a style, because there's a lot of different theories and opinions out there on it.
Yeah, well, so in addition to those two kind of historic styles, I mean, we have Kentucky rye, which can be, as low rye as the 51% minimum, like the wild turkey that I'm having right now, all the way up to, I mean, I don't know anyone doing 95.5 in Kentucky, but no, that's not true because I think New Riff does 95.5, but they pulled that from another rye style that I think has really established itself in the consciousness of rye drinkers in the last 10, 15 years, which is what I call MGP style, 95.5, because it was really made famous by Larry Ebersole at MGP. It's their signature mash bill for rye, and it's the rye that launched 1,000 brands. As anyone who was drinking rye about 10 years ago would know. And, you know, MGP was the source for, I would say, the majority of rye brands, just, you know, numerically speaking, on the market. And so that has kind of established itself as I think, a really distinct flavor profile. And then we have, I live in New York, we have Empire Rye, which is this budding movement among New York distillers. That's a minimum of 75% rye grain. It has to be grown in New York, aged at least 2 years, things like that. So also trying to establish itself. So it's interesting to see these little pockets popping up. And then, of course, we have folks like Herman, who you're drawing on this legacy of rye distilling in your backyard in Pennsylvania, but it's not like, you know, you can sort of get all the old yeasts and have your 3-chamber still ready and have your heat cycled warehouses and all the other things that were kind of happening in the 19th century down there. You're forging Pennsylvania rye for the 21st century, kind of in a new way. And one of the things that I'm super interested that you've been doing is working with heritage grains like rosin rye. Can you tell us a little bit about that project that you're engaged in and what that has entailed? Rosin, you know, explain to us what rosin rye is.
Well, rosin rye, you know, doing our research before we started the business in 2008, 2009, we did a lot of, you know, book research, just looking up everything that we could find online and buying old books about what people were doing. And looking at particularly some of the advertising in the 40s and 50s, there was a lot of, you find it on bottles, you find it in even magazine ads. You know, there was a Shenley ad from the late 40s, I think, that was, you know, boasted they're using rosin rye, you know. And in fact, I think I think it's still there. There's a bakery in Chicago called the Rosin Bakery. You know, there was because of that too. So rosin rye was a grain introduced in 1909 at Michigan State by complete coincidence by a Russian immigrant who brought that rye from Russia, who, you know, basically saying, look, we have this really great rye over there. We can bring it over here. And it was introduced broadly in North America and was used quite a lot. So we had that reference. And so I started I called the Penn State Extension, the agricultural people, and finally I called Michigan State in like 2011, something like that. And I said, hey, you know, I'm trying to find this rosin rye stuff and nobody seems to know where it is. He said, well, you can try the seed repository, you know, where they keep all the seeds in case of a Holocaust or something. And but you have to be a researcher to get access to that. And so it just so happened there was an article being written about rye by a professor at Penn State. And I contacted him and I said, hey, could you include rosin rye in, you know, the work you're doing? So he got 5 grams of rye and started planting it up there. I sort of lost that connection and we started over again at Del Valle University, which is right up the road here. And so we've been plowing, you know, starting with 5 grams and then, you know, geometrically growing every year. Now we're in our we've planted at the farm where we get most of our rye up in Meadowbrook Farms in Bucks County. We're planting, you know, acres and acres now. So we made a few small batches, but we wanted to use as much grain as we could to get back into the ground to grow enough to start spreading it around. I mean, we're going to use it. I'm hoping, you know, that it will be used broadly across the board for Pennsylvania rye and anyone else who wants to buy it. I mean, part of my objective is that speaking with the people from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture saying, you know, I was shocked, and I know this might not be the case anymore, but I was shocked years ago when I went down to tour Wild Turkey and they were talking about the rye grain that they get from Germany. And I was like, Germany? I mean, you know, what? You know, I was shocked, you know, and I said, man, you know, I have a feeling that if you connect with Pennsylvania or American farmers, you should be able to get some good rye grain somewhere. So part of the idea is to reintroduce rye growing to Pennsylvania farmers that will allow them to supply the industry. but also taking an intriguing look at Rose and Rye and what in fact did or didn't make it unique. Now, we've seen a few signs of things. We've done some of our early distillations on the small little, my grandpa's old still, that I used to work in the flavor and fragrance industry, so I was able to actually submit some of our distillate to some guys doing some real deep dive analytical stuff in the laboratory. We've seen some things that are different. Some different chemical species that in the fragrance area, so fragrance and flavor area. So we're hopeful that might mean something. Whether it will pan out or not, we don't know. But so far, the signs are interestingly positive. And this year's going to be fun because this year we planted a lot, and I'm going to we have every batch we do a 2,000 pounds of rye. So that's about an acre. So we need to in order to run commercial quantities, we need acres of rye. We now have that. So this year we'll be running, and we'll be able to do apples to apples comparisons rather than doing it on the small still. We'll be able to compare it to what we're doing on our 2,000 liter, 500 gallon still. So we're really excited about that. At the end of the day, is Rose and Rye going to be spectacular? I don't know. We'll find out. And there's been some of the Penn State rye has found its way to some other distillers across Pennsylvania, which is great. And so we're going to have a nice cross section of samples to try in the coming years, which are going to be a lot of fun to testing is always fun. So we'll have to see how that comes out.
It's interesting to be part of, like, we're in this kind of like great space where we're learning as an industry as to where we can take rye. I mean, this is hearing what Herman's doing with Rosen, and it's really, really good to get the attention back on the grain. It's that's one of the other things that actually was rye's demise, coming out of Prohibition, was the corn subsidies. So it's economically more feasible to grow corn than it is rye. So it's like getting the conversation out there and having the conversation with farmers on the benefits of growing rye grain outside but inclusive of the rye whiskey arena. But there's other huge benefits to growing rye grain that we're now just starting to uncover. And then you tack on the what we can do for the category using different styles of grain. I mean, it's a really great time to be working in making good rye. So.
And what's been interesting that I've learned over the past 10 years, we started working with several farms in Pennsylvania, and now we're actually only working with one primarily. And the reason why is because the proprietor there, the Meese family, Nevada Meese is the farmer's name. They've been on that land since 1716. They're very serious about the kind of things they do. And to their credit, they've made investments, because aside from the which is it a Bruzy or is it Rosen, having a farmer who pays attention to producing a rye that's suitable for making whiskey or bread, if even, it's not the norm, because most of the farmers across the country are planting rye as a cover crop and harvesting it early as hay or even earlier as straw. And so having a farmer who's patient enough to leave it in the ground until the hot days in July when it's really dry and really ripe, having a good ripe rye berry is important. We've had farmers send us stuff that's not ripe and it's not suitable. It doesn't make good whiskey. And Nevada, to his credit, has invested in a special drying system and a special cleaning system and a special storage system that is modified specifically for rye. So sometimes you get farmers using corn cleaners and things that don't quite do the job. So when they put the rye into storage, it doesn't store well. So he's put the energy into every step of the way, making sure he makes a really superior product. And so all year round, we get deliveries from Nevada, and the stuff's just is beautiful. It's ripe, it's tasty, it's really a well produced raw materials, and I think that plays as much a role in getting a good product as ultimately which variety ends up being interesting or not. So encouraging farmers to grow it and to pay attention to growing it well in the right way is part of what we're trying to do as well.
I think, yeah, you make a good point. And for farmers, if they're incentivized by the fact that rye grown for distillation is higher quality and commands a much higher price, certainly much higher than the cover crop, hopefully those synergies can be found. Having a partner farmer who can serve as an example to other farmers who are interested and, can show them that it's a viable way of farming is that's great.
It's also good, it's also good for the planet too.
Well,
yeah, there's a lot of other things too. With rye. In fact, there's a new, and now I'm going to forget his name. Robinson is his first name. There's a new grouping formed in he's based out of New York, but he's reaching out to Ari, I guess, is one of the other guys involved. Ari Sussman and people like that. They're doing a deep dive into the cradle to grave economics and ecological balance sheet of rye compared to other grains, and it's nitrogen fixing. It has very deep roots. It's very good for holding water and holding soil and all these other kind of benefits. It's a much less resource intensive grain to grow than corn. And they're trying to spread that gospel to everybody, to farmers, to bakers, to distillers, to everybody, to say, hey, using more rye is actually good for the environment. So we're encouraged by that too.
Well, as drinkers, we can all do our part by drinking more.
Yeah.
You got to do what you can. Do what you can.
We have a question here from Marshall Sanders. They're asking, is Prohibition style, in quotes, a marketing push? What is the benefit of doing it in an old style that is arguably dated versus what distilleries could possibly make improvements with better technology or ratios?
Now I'm going to take issue with something that Bradford said earlier, and I might be wrong, but it's what I think is that we've actually put on our straight whiskey now a Prohibition style, and the reason why we do that is that I was told by some fairly reputable folks, and I think the chemistry supports it, that going up to a 95% rye grain and only 5% malt mash bill only became possible when you could supplement the mash bill, the mash with enzymes. Doing a very low malt style is very difficult to do without enzymes. Back before Prohibition style, pre-Prohibition, they didn't have enzymes. They had to have enough malt in there to turn that mash. And if you don't do a good conversion in your mash with rye, some of you may have heard the stories, you get a big, sticky, bubbly mess, okay? So getting a good conversion with your enzymes is important. So that's why using 15 or 20% malt was kind of the benchmark back in the day. So I think that that pre-Prohibition style, we put that out there to tell people that, yeah, we're doing it the way it was done back then, using malt for the enzymes. And that's all nice, because frankly, there's nothing wrong with using enzymes. But the reason why we like to emphasize that is that we think that 20% malt brings really good flavor. So by, and I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Bradford, but I'm guessing that when Seagram's was making that 95.5, they were doing it for blending purposes, and they were just trying to reduce their cost. So, taking malt out reduces your cost. So
yeah, and there's also instances of 95.5, but of that 95, there would be potentially some malting of rye as well. So you'd have that 5% malted barley, but you also have a percentage of malted rye aiding in the
and malted rye does have a high diastatic contribution. So
but there's other aspects to quote unquote Prohibition style. There's distillation proof. There's barreling strength proof or barrel entry proof. We've seen research and we've seen documentation that the on average the distillation pre-Prohibition, during Prohibition, would be lower than the industry standard of like 125 proof nowadays. So you're coming off the still at a lower proof. Additionally, they would put that whiskey into the barrel at a lower proof, because right now you can put whiskey into a barrel maxed at 125. Is that right, Herman? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, that comes down to like the more alcohol you put in the barrel, you get a higher yield. If you put a lower proof spirit into the barrel, you get a lot more flavor, but you get a lower yield. So during that pre-prohibition, during prohibition, and probably actually a little bit after prohibition, you actually have that lower proof. So that prohibition style, you'll see it across all different styles of brands. There's different levers to why you want to say we're done in a prohibition style, whether it's grain, mash bill, whether it's distillation proof, whether it's barrel entry. There's a lot of different factors you can
that's true. Yep.
Play with.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, and I just want to say that prohibition style or X style, Y style, it's not about being better or worse. It's not that prohibition style is better than what someone's making in the 21st century. They're just different styles, different ways to express the rye grain and to express rye whiskey. And thankfully, I think there's room on the bar for all of those different kinds of rye. I certainly like to have a variety. We have a couple more questions here. I'm going to do one and then the other before we're out of time, because this next one kind of builds a little bit on that. Can anyone offer an opinion how products coming out of MGP can be so different, yet they come from roughly the same area and distilled under similar conditions? Anyone want to take that? I'm also happy to take it, but you guys are
Herman, what do you think?
the experts.
I don't know. I mean, I've spent so much energy focused on what we're doing. I don't follow very closely what they're doing, so I really couldn't tell. I haven't had enough experience tasting the different variations. I imagine their barrel conditions and where they are and how long and so forth, and the barrels themselves, where they're sourcing the barrels. I mean, we've settled on a couple of cooperages that we like the best, and we try to do our best to get our barrels from those cooperages because we like the flavor that comes from them. So it's possible that if they're using 3 or 4 different cooperages, they might get different profiles depending on where their cooperage is coming from. So
I mean, there's other yes, MGP, their classic, their standard is 95.5, but that is only one piece to, for lack of a better analogy, the cake that they're baking, right? Because you have other factors besides the mash bill. Yeah, we have a tendency as an industry to kind of reduce like what a particular product tastes like just by the amount of rye or corn or barley it has in it. But there's the art of a good distiller is you take that mash bill, but then you start playing with distillation proof, right? So that'll affect your flavor. Then your barrel entry proof will affect the flavor, and then, like to what Herman said, like the barrels are very distinct as well. So you can distill on the same day, barrel on the same day, put those barrels in the same warehouse on the same day, right next to each other. You crack them open 5, 6, 10 years later, they're related, right? But they can be distinctly different. So again, then you're the next step. So where's MGP pulling? Because barrel warehouse management is a big factor in our industry. Like where you're putting the barrels. Take for instance like Booker's. Bourbon, right? But we did make a rye for Booker's. But like the Booker's thing was that center cut, that filet mignon of a 9-story warehouse, right, smack in the middle, and that was kind of like where everything was really harmonious, and it developed a very distinct style of whiskey that we call Booker's. Now, that Booker's mash bill is the same mash bill for some of our other products. So again, it comes down to like being able to flex a little bit on distillation, proofing, all that stuff, but then like where those barrels, how old was the tree that supplied the particular wood for this particular barrel? Like there's so many different factors. We'd like to say that we can crack it, but there's definitely some magic too on top of it.
One of the things we found, we have the vast majority of our barrels are stored. Our 53-gallon barrels are all upstairs in the 5th floor in a old textile mill. So it's a rather controlled environment. So we can control the environment in the. It's not a rick house, so it's thick concrete walls and all that stuff. But we also have some of our barrels we keep downstairs in the distillery, in the back of the distillery, where the temperature variations are extreme. I mean, when we're distilling in the summertime, it can get to be 100 degrees in there. And in the wintertime, because I'm cheap, I don't like to pay for heat, so it gets down to in the 50s or 40s even. So so they see a lot of variation, and there is a distinct difference between the barrels that are stored downstairs and the ones that are stored upstairs. There's absolutely no doubt they're very distinctive.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that very quickly, and then we'll get to our last question. That a lot of it also is the hands of the blender. We were talking about rectifying before. Yep. Producers, brands that buy barrels from MGP to bottle under their own name. Some of them are just, it's just from the barrel into the bottle. They're not doing anything else. But others are actually, they're pulling select barrels and making blends and maybe doing finishes or things like that to add something a little more special, a little more distinct to the whiskey that's coming out of MGP. So it's any number of reasons. But if you visit any distillery, you'll see that 5 barrels in a row, all the same mash bill, all barreled on the same day. They're not all going to taste exactly the same.
And one of the things that I'm very fortunate. My business partner John Cooper has a really excellent palate, and so I'm more driven by what I'll smell the glass, I'll taste, I go, yeah. I mean, it hits that bell in my head that goes back to when I was a teenager. John is more analytical about it, so he'll get involved in like we just this week just harvested a bunch of barrels, and he'll say, okay, let's pull some from over here, some over here, and we'll put them together. And one of the things we do at Dad's Hat, which is I don't know how unique it is, but in our small craft world, it's a little unique. We have 6,000 liter tanks that where we vat our whiskey, and it's those tanks never empty. So we have a straight tank, we have our classic rye tank, we have smaller ones for the vermouth and port finishes. So the whiskey goes in, whiskey comes out to bottle, but we never empty that tank. So the tank stays roughly a third to half full. So the next bunch of barrels that go in are mixing with what we bottled last time. And so what we'll do is we'll pull samples out of the tank after it's been reduced, and then like we just did this yesterday. We'll take barrel samples, we'll put them together, and see what that's getting a little dry. We probably need to pick up some fruity stuff. Let's pick up a couple of barrels that are a little fruitier, and we'll throw them together. And John's really good at that. He's got a really good palate for helping that. So we work together on making those things. And you're right. So you can blend your way into a style, and that we try to keep relatively consistent on our standard products. So.
All right, we are out of time, but I think this is a great question to end on, and I'm giving you each, this is the ticking clock of 15 seconds. All right, this is going to be a challenge. Why do you think rye is increasing in popularity?
Do I go first, Herman?
It's easy. It's delicious.
I love it.
Well
I love
said.
it.
Simple.
That's cool.
Simple.
So, all right. So rye, ironically, was the first frontier, right? Now it's the next frontier. People are looking for something new, something different, and rye comes with receipts on that. So it's delicious, and it's new and exciting, and ironically, really old. So,
by the way, this 1940 old overhaul,
yeah,
pretty tasty.
Pretty tasty.
You're bragging. You're bragging.
I am. Yes, I am. I am bragging. Yes, I am.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for being here. This hour has flown by. This has been a great time for me. I hope it's been great for everyone who attended. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. If you missed any part of this, there will be a replay on Bevridge, also on YouTube. So please, tune in, rewind, listen to Bradford give that sweet little, the next frontier right there at the end. You got a marketing campaign there, Bradford.
That's right, I'm working on it.
It was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation.
This is fun for me. Yeah, super great. Don't forget, everyone who's here, come back next week for our next panel. Check out bevridge.co for our past panels, also for the upcoming American Single Malt Tasting Kit, which looks really great. And just join us every Wednesday. We'll be doing this. Next week, it's going to get a little nerdy. My friend Camper English, the Iceman, is leading a session on whiskey on ice. I've never met someone who knows more about ice than Camper. So if you have literally any question about it, he's going to be able to answer it. I personally am excited. Please tune in. Thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Finish what's in your glass.
Stop by the distillery in Pennsylvania. We're open for tours again, so see you on some Saturday when you're in the Northeast. So
awesome.
Perfect.
Cheers.
Take care,
Thanks,
everybody.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.